The button. All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're able to sit down with us for a little while. Terry Francis and I are going to do something that, at least for me, I think it's going to be fun. We're going to take some time to talk about Bibles, but not so much maybe in the ways that we might otherwise do, at least for a good 2/3 or so of our conversation. So, Terry, how you doing?
I'm doing great, man.
In the way.
Really, really looking forward to the discussion today. This is like one of my nerd areas, to be honest with you. So,
Sweet. We get to see Terry nerd out. This is going to be awesome.
but it's not in typical Terry Francis fashion. I don't nerd out in the scholarly way. It's the well, some would describe it materialistic, and we'll get into that. So,
Yeah, yeah. I'll say this. I think what we're going to talk about, we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about what about your Bible. We're going to try to keep it light and fun today for a lot of good reasons. But we are going to deal with some of the scholarly academic aspects of selecting a text, selecting a layout, selecting a quality production of that, and why it matters, especially in a digital age, because I'm super digital. Terry's probably a little bit less. And I still really value a print Bible for a number of very good reasons. But I use them in different ways because they're tools to an end rather than art pieces, which they are also art. But I look at them as a tool first, but I want a quality tool.
right.
So let's kind of break some things down to set the stage for where we're going to be. And so starting right with it, let's talk about translations and really talk about the underside of translations to begin with. And this is what I mean by that. When we talk about translations, what I'm personally talking about are the difficulties in bringing the various language groups from what we'll consider the Old Testament and the New Testament. If your background is different than mine, you might be talking about the Old Testament and the Bible, which is how a lot of structured high church groups refer to the New Testament. They say that's the Bible. But when we're talking about it, we're saying we've got like maybe 4 languages in play at times that are translated into English. And it's important to think through your selection in that process. Like, okay, what am I going to do? Why am I going to do it that way? What do we have going on? So, Terry, tell me a little bit first, like, and this will help us get there, the translations that you use or have used over the years. What were they, and what was the process to get to them? And then in a second, I'm going to interject with a few moments of commentary on the manuscript groups that exist that produce these translations.
Yeah. So, growing up, when I was really young, I think like most people, since I grew up in the church, I was raised on the steady diet of the King James. And then when the New King James started to become popular, my dad, who was a really good Bible class teacher, switched to that and switched us kids to that because of the readability. And I stayed on the New King James probably just as a common member until of the New King James until I was probably at Florida College, and it was recommended that we buy a New American Standard Bible for our classes. So I bought one of those. When I decided to go back into to preach, which is about 2 years after I left Florida College, I had switched back to the New King James because of familiarity. And also, we'll talk about manuscript stuff, and you're more familiar with some of that than I am. I just know a little bit enough to be dangerous. But one of the deciding factors for me in my 20 plus years of preaching has been not just the manuscript evidence, but also the availability of the translation to the common member. One of my frustrations with the New American Standard when I started preaching was they were difficult to get a hold of because of who controlled the copyrights to that. They were generally a little more expensive, and they were generally back then, the quality was terrible at that time. So nobody had a New American Standard, or very few people did. If you were to poll your audience, most of them had the King James and the New King James. And the New King James at that time you could buy at Walmart. That's how accessible it was. And so I preached with New King James probably, oh man, first probably 12, 13 years I was New King James, New King James. ESV came out, and I did not switch right away. But eventually I did switch to the ESV, and part of that was driven by that it was a better translation from the manuscripts of the New King James by far, but it was still had a readability that was acceptable. And I know some guys don't like the readability of the ESV. They prefer the Christian Standard Bible, which used to be the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which I think is also good. Came out at the same time as ESV. But again, the reason I don't use the CSB and use the ESV, and now you're confused by all the alphabet soup, is because of the availability. Just a lot of people don't have the Christian Standard Bible. They have the English Standard Version. And I like the English Standard Version. I can tell you a lot of reasons why I do. Are there passages I don't like? Yes, but there are passages I don't like in every translation. That's just part of this discussion. And coupled with the fact that the ESV is probably even more available now than the New King James is. Probably the most common translation out there today. And I will tell you another driving force, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is the quality of the publishing. Crossway Publishing, which does the majority of ESV publishing, I think for affordable Bibles has to do probably the best job of any Bible publisher that I know or have known for a long time. You can buy an ESV in their True Tone cover for about $30, maybe 40, and it has a good guarantee on it. Again, it's not 100%, but it lasts longer than other cheaper Bibles. I don't buy cheap Bibles, and we'll talk about that later. But if that's who you are, the English Standard Version from a quality standpoint, which we'll talk about in a minute, is far better. So that's really what drove me into those kind of markets. And the best way to describe the readability of the translation of the ESV that I ever heard, it was like the New King James and the New American Standard. And understand the New American Standard was probably the most accurate translation, I would say. And New King James was the most readable. Those are at odds with each other, by the way. The more readable you get, the less accurate you get, just because of what we're about to talk about. But imagine that they were two people that had a child together. Their first child would be the English Standard Version, and their second child would be the Christian Standard Bible. And I think that's why it's so popular, is they're more accurate than the New King James, and they're more readable than the New American Standard. And that's really how I arrived at that decision for myself. That gives you a synopsis of my kind of history through that. Hal mentions the Net Bible. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's a completely different animal for me. But we'll get to that.
Yeah. So my journey I posted about earlier a couple days ago in a couple of places, and so people might already be aware of it. I will talk about a couple of those translation choices in process real quickly. So this text right here, if you would like to see, is the first Bible that I was given by a close family friend. And you can see her name still in the gift there, that we referred to as Grandma Brown. Miss Dorothy Brown was not my grandmother, but my mom took her in after my mom's best friend passed and said, "You're one of us now." And so we treated Dorothy like family. She was an extra grandma to us. I had Thanksgiving with her in Texas a couple times. So this was given to me in as a graduation gift from high school. I read it from Genesis to Revelation and started looking around for people doing what I found in here, and eventually sat in on a Bible study with Rob Hudson, who was preaching for the Sunnyvale Church of Christ in Sunnyvale, California. And so this one's super special. Plus, it's got a really awesome patina with the leather on. It's pretty cool. But then when I went to Florida College, I stopped using that and moved to a blue edition that looked just like this of the New American Standard. picked up an American Standard, picked up another New American Standard, another American Standard, and New American Standard. Started using that for a while, primarily because of its accuracy. And then I noticed the ESV came out around 2001. Mark Roberts started using it in some of his work. I read it and I felt like I was being covered in glitter because it felt like the Twilight edition of the Bible. It was so simplified, it was so linear in some ways. But then I stepped back 2017 or so and said, I want a Bible that when I sit down to study with someone, I don't have to explain the grammar anymore. I don't have to explain complicated words anymore, but I still feel like it's doing its very best to be a good, wholesome translation. In the end, the CSB and the ESV, the Christian Standard Bible and the ESV were the two to look from, and the ESV was just more popular. More people were using it. And I'm like, okay, even though I probably liked the CSB a little bit more, ESV seemed better. And then right now, I think it's probably that and the New King James you're going to find some of the best bindings being produced, the best layouts physically into their Bibles. So sometimes in our conversations that Jerry and I have, I'll mention manuscripts, the original language basket of fragments, manuscripts, etc. that we have that we derive the text from. And there's a lot. That's a really complicated section that we are definitely not going to deeply get into right now. Because there's a whole lot. But I just want to point out there's about 4 major groups, if you will. Some of them are really similar. And I say major groups in the sense of how they kind of clump things together. If you're looking at, and we'll say you use the King James here, you're talking about things that are going to pull off of Textus Receptus, the Vulgate. They're going to pull off of maybe some of the Masoretic texts for the Old Testament, the Septuagint as well, some of the Byzantine stuff. They're all pulling in to create the manuscript that the translators pick from to create the text. One of the myths that exist is that, like for the King James, that text block is static now. It's not really. They're still continuing to refine the text. The text that produced, say, Erasmus's first parts of it, because he's part of that process, is different than what then produced the 10 different editions and translations that are called the King James, because you've got everything from the 1611 to the 2016 King James edition, which is a newer edition I didn't know about until about 5 minutes ago when I was looking at my notes. But there's tons of those translations, and so they work from that group. The weakness to that group is that it does not have the text copies from the earliest findings closest to the writers, particularly with the New Testament, but not exclusively the New Testament.
Let me say this real quick, Phil. That's kind of the misnomer that I think. I've had somebody tell me, I want the old King James. It's more accurate. What's funny is the translations with the word new in front of them, or the newer translations, are actually, in theory, more accurate because their manuscripts they use are older than what we consider to be the old reliable translation. And that's one of the things, the best way to describe, I try to describe people without maybe losing them is, okay, this is what you think is old, but actually that translation is based on manuscripts that are newer than the ones that are being used now.
Right.
And that's one thing to understand.
And so there's a lot more complexity that goes into that. The other baskets that exist of what text you're going to pull from try their very best to balance manuscripts that are closer to the first century, closer to the time of the Israelites as a spiritual nation and a physical nation. And so they'll reach and say, well, we've got this that helps us maybe understand this part of the puzzle. And so you'll see that. You'll note that most translations include bits and pieces about it. They'll say, this part is not in the earliest manuscripts. That's a buzzword that says this has been added to the text. That's kind of what it means.
Hmm.
Um, and so when people come to me and say things like, well, I don't like that translation because it's missing this part from my King James translation. So I'm like, so you like it when people add to the Bible? You like that?
Yeah, Acts 8:37 is a good one there in the story of the eunuch. That spelled out confession of I believe Jesus is the Son of God. That in verse 37, the ESV goes from verse 36 to verse 38.
Yeah.
And I've had people complain about, well, they took away. And the reality is no, they actually gave you a more accurate translation from earlier manuscripts.
Um,
And it's really
and I
hard
don't
for
get
us to understand.
yeah, and I don't get super excited about it because without exception to the base of my understanding, you don't have change in theology, you don't have change in ideas, you just have a shift in repetition of ideas.
Right, right.
Um, all right, so that is like a small thing into the big thing we're trying to talk about, which is so now you've selected your translation, and I think maybe in the future we'll probably do a little more deep dive into the translation process and bring in someone with more expertise than me and more expertise
Great.
than Terry to
That
talk
means
about textual
Salts
criticism.
is joining us again.
Who says it's gonna be salts? There's smarter people than salts out there. I want to emphasize um, and that's not really a hard thing to do to supersede
Yeah,
the intellect of the salty boy.
yeah,
Um, I hope is watching right now because we've called him like Beetlejuice at this point. So let's talk
exactly.
a little bit about the next thing that we've got laid out for us, which is not so much your translation choice, because I think a lot of people put a lot of good effort into it, and I think you should keep doing that. And if you have a particular favorite translation, if it's essentially a formal translation seeking to give a good sense of the text, you're probably great. Um, so we talk about the text itself and the layout and the way things are formatted and maybe the bindery you're talking about. Um, a lot of things go on in that process. I want to make a side note. Terry, you've got one of your journal ones. You want to show your journaling edition real quick? I think you've
Yeah,
got that running
so
out there.
so I was going to show this. This is what I use to teach Bible classes when I'm in a verse by verse kind of setting. This is my Job. I'm at the point where I don't write in my Bibles I preach from. Phil doesn't either. We were talking about that earlier. We find it distracting because it makes us think we've missed something. But I can take this. And I mark it up. And it's also, in most cases, the only exception is Psalms. I'll show you. Psalms is almost as big as a normal Bible. But Job, for instance, is a lot smaller. It's easy to hold on to. I have the entire set. It'll set you back about 100 to 120 bucks, depending on where you buy it. Highly
You can get it
recommend
cheaper.
this.
You can get them
Um,
actually $60 on Amazon right now.
okay, so
60,
that's
70
gone down.
bucks.
But I really recommend that. And I also have, by the way, so if I'm coffee house sitting for the day, I've got a one whole journal Bible that we have a thing that Adam Shakes did called Laying the Tracks. It has different notes in it for me. It's not as marked up as my journal Bible sets, but I've got those
Hmm.
tracks laid out through here that I can have an impromptu study at any moment. So this is my coffee house journal Bible. Um, Real quickly, we talk about other things. This is what I call this is the 6-volume reader set that Crossway makes. Biblioteca made that too. There are no chapter divisions in this. This is a great tool. No chapter, no verses. Reads just like a normal book. It's a great tool when you get ready to teach a class. And I turn my back and should never do that. As you get ready to teach a class, it's always great to read through that book with all that stuff gone. Again, I haven't looked at the price lately. Probably around $100 for the whole set. They all come in their own little boxes to keep them in, and those are Crossway. They do a really good job with that. Churches can buy, and I think you've done that. We've done this last year with Mark. You can buy those journaling Bibles at like $5 a piece, and it's a really good tool that if you're doing a Bible study just on one class, and I know they're doing this at Eastside where Phil's at. It's a really good way to teach people how to make notes to really do that well. and gives them a remarkable tool. And the theory is, as I study through these books, that this becomes like my own private commentary with my own notes. And what I like about that is I can take that to class and I can teach class out of that. Then when I preach, I can go back to one of my preaching Bibles. So a little bit more about text. Text blocking deals with a lot of stuff. The very first question that you're going to get into is verse by verse versus paragraph notation. And I was drug into the paragraph notation of the ESV kicking and screaming. I was one of those guys because the New King James is verse by verse. That's what I grew up on. That's what I preferred. I would, and I know guys now that would switch the ESV if they had a verse by verse, and they do. I have one of those single column verse by verse. They're out of print. It's a great text block. I've actually completely done a 180 on that, Phil. I love paragraph notation because it preserves context so much better than probably I did previously with verse by verse. So when you start talking about text block, a lot of things you're talking about are verse by verse, single column versus double column, whether it's a center reference at the bottom, whether it's a study Bible or not a study Bible. There's a lot of factors when we talk about text blocking that goes into that. You and I were nerding out over font size, 9.5 point versus 10. And as weird as that sounds, by the way, there's a huge difference between 9.5 and 10 point font. And the older we get, the more important that becomes.
And it's not even about visual, I can see it or not. Like when you're younger, your eyes, there's a change that takes place as your body ages that you cannot focus as close to the text. So if I get too close to the passage, like my face gets closer and closer, literally you won't see it eventually. But that's not so much the issue. Font size also impacts how the words are spaced on the page, and how much is on each page. And to a certain degree, when it comes for me as using a preaching tool, I don't want a lot on the page. I do like, right now I have this really neat genuine leather Crossway ESV. I love the binding on this one. But I don't even really like reference notes in the Bibles that I preach from for the most part, where they've got cross references and details, although that actually is my favorite binding layout right now, which is this ESV thin line large print reference edition that has text blocks that look like this. So I would kind of like to get rid of them but keep everything else the same, but I haven't really found that.
Yeah. So I'm going to show real quick. This is both ESVs from Luke. This is my first ESV, which is an ESV thin line in genuine leather. And this is what the text block looks like. It's not bad, but the center column is a little distracting. It's very busy. This is my Omega thin line, which I don't preach out anymore, but it's also Luke 1. And the font's 10 point, which is slightly larger. The center column is gone. It's just a lot cleaner. And when you're preaching, they're about the same size and weight. When you're preaching, that cleaner approach makes a huge difference in your ability to recognize where verses are and so forth. So that plays a big role. By the way, I'm probably trying to put a link. There's several Bible blogs, but Matt Bassford has done this for a while, where he'll review. I don't know if he's doing it as much anymore, but he would review different text blocks and bindings, and had a really good way to look at things before you actually purchase. And I would recommend that somewhat.
Okay, so one other thing I want us to make us conclude is why the quality of your bindery matters. I'm going to show. This is my New American Standard. I actually I used this one for a long time. The font's too small for me now. The center column reference is not what I prefer, but I do love the size and weight of this translation's layout. And so there's what I'm talking about there. But this is what happens to them. This is the binding on it from using it, from opening it up and reading it on a regular basis.
And here's mine. Here's my New American Standard, and this is bonded leather, and the same thing's happening. The leather topping is coming off, is what's happening.
So here's the practical side of that. We're talking about a Bible that I probably used for 18 months. And so I did this to this Bible from just typical preacher use of it for 18 months. If this was one that I was taking notes in, now my notes are useless because the Bible is now, this one's on the edge of falling apart. So I'm going to have to rebind it if I want to keep using it. It's also now lost investment value in the sense of the tool. I got to set it aside. Now, I might set it aside for other reasons. I decided I want to hold on to this one, and so I added it to my, this is a historical document to connect to Pat file, if you will. But this is the one I'm using now. It's another bonded leather one. It's like Crossway's bonded leather. This one has held up pretty well.
Yeah, the
This
true
one's 2
tone's
years
really
in.
well. Yeah.
But I can tell you, and you can feel it when you hold it, it's starting to get to the point where it's going to start cracking soon. Like that's just a matter of time. I can feel it. I can see it. I can recognize it. So
Yes.
those Bibles, cheap, $20.
Yeah.
You can get a bonded, a True Tone, $20. A quality leather Bible.
And by the way, Phil, their pages are put in differently. That's a glued binding in those books.
Yeah.
Versus a sewn binding. And so those glued bindings are the ones where pages start to fall out. If you've ever seen a Bible where maybe a page gets torn on the sewn binding and it slips out just like a 2 millimeters above the other pages, the reason, if it's a glued binding, that's going to fall out. But since it's sewn in, it's going to stay in, even though it's a little off. So it's not just about what cover, but also whether the binding is sewn or glued. And you want to avoid glued, which, by the way, full disclosure, this raises the cost. But especially if you're a preacher, look, mechanics don't buy their tools from Walmart. They buy them from Snap-on because they last longer, and when they break, Snap-on replaces them. If you spend more money on a Bible, it will last longer, and you won't have. It's more investment up front, but long term, it's better off. Is the idea.
And do some research ahead of time by talking to other folks who use the same translation that you do, because they're more likely to know the publishers of the various layouts and translations that you use, and kind of build a package of information first. And the sooner you do that, the better off you'll be. You'll avoid bad purchases. Because you want these things to be available to you for 50 years. If you really love your translation, one of the reasons I bought this ASV hardbound was because Melvin Curry was using the ASV and he was still using the same edition that he had in one of his classes. He also liked the New American Standard too, but a particular class he was using ASV. I'm like, I'll try that. But he had that one for a long time because it was a quality text. It was a quality layout and printing of it. They don't make ASVs of quality anymore that I'm aware of. Plus, I wouldn't recommend it given what's available right now. There's so many better translations and texts. So I also want to talk about a couple other things related to this just before we kind of summarize this stuff. When you're making all these choices, and the cost is a factor too, know this: there's some great used outlets for a lot of this. Facebook Marketplace has 4 or 5 different groups that people are selling, copies of various translations that are lightly used. I've got this one right here, which is a blemished one. So around Psalm 53, there was some water that got into it, and it softened the pages, but you give this a year's worth of use, you will not even notice the wrinkling from that thing, and that brought the price down. This was $30 for a high quality leather bound, good translation, good binding that will last. Like it's going to hang around for a while.
Yeah, and my go-to Bible, by the way, which is an R.L. Allen NC1 ESV. It's got a goatskin cover, hand sewn, better quality paper. It's got a quarter yap, which yap is how much it hangs over the edge. There's a lot of nerdy stuff like Yap and raised hubs and how many ribbons. It's got 3 ribbons. And the Allen and the Schylers are kind of the top of the cream of the crop of the premium Bibles. I bought this one used off of one of the Facebook Marketplace sites for around $200, which sounds like a whole lot, but it is better. It is cheaper than it would be new. Jay Taylor talks about keeping the boxes. I keep the boxes when they're available. This ESV NC1, I still have the box to it. When I travel, it goes back in its box and it's transported in the box, which is why it's still in good shape. And I do that with as many of those as I can. I've got 2 Omegas. One's a 75th, one's an 80th edition. Used to preach for them all the time before I got the Allen. Both of them have their boxes. Both are in. You'll see somewhere on the 75th because I preached out of it for 6 years before I replaced it with the 80. So again, you're going to invest money into this, but you'll get money in the long term. I don't suggest any preacher, because of how much we hold our Bibles, even when we're preaching, and the amount of just the oil from your skin breaks things down in the bonded leather. I don't suggest anything below genuine leather. So what you're looking at is genuine leather, premium cow skin, calf skin, goat skin. Those are the versions of leather I recommend, which cost more money. They also usually mean that they're sewn bindings, they're better bindings. You're not going to be spending money on rebinding that Bible eventually. It's more of a long-term purchase in that sense.
We didn't cover it, but one more thing. I've just got about a minute or two left in our schedule. If you're going to write in the Bible, that's your tool. That's something that you want to be very precise about. For a long time, especially before I switched to doing some digital note taking, which is a lot of what I do now, I carried a small, flexible ruler as a page marker in my Bible. I only used the same physical utensils to write into them, and so I had a couple. I still have a couple of them lying around. Some drafting type pens and pencils that I would use to write into them to create smooth, fine lines, because the last thing I need is distraction. And I can easily be distracted, and so I wanted everything to be precise. So I get that ruler out, and if I'm underlining, I underline with a ruler. It really makes a difference. If I want to connect things, I'll use the ruler to draw the connector, because I want the line to be precise and accomplish its goals. And some of those rulers actually have a lot of the curves and rounds that you can use to make those lines perfect. That's a little bit my obsessiveness, but it's
the other thing is the thinness of the page plays a role into that. So if you use a traditional highlighter on a cheaper Bible, the paper's so thin it's going to bleed through and you're going to see it. There's just no way around that. These premium Bibles like the Allen, the Schylers, the Omegas, and some of those, the heirlooms, I had some heirlooms before. I resold those. And I will tell you this, if you buy a Bible, one of the premium, what's considered a premium Bible, whether it's Allen, Schuyler, Crossway, Cambridge makes great Bibles, whatever you buy, one of the things I want to tell you is you can pretty much get your money out of that Bible. You can sell that to somebody else. You may sell it to a friend and give them a discount. I've done that before. But they not only do you buy these and they're going to last, but if you don't like it and you buy it, you can turn around and sell it and pretty much make your money back in most cases, because you've invested money into it. If you're going to write in your Bible and it's a premium Bible, make sure you use utensils that are acid free, that aren't going to damage the Bible in the long term, which I know sounds like a lot of nerdy stuff, but you got to take all that into account when you do that.
So Terry and I obviously could talk about this for another couple hours, because we already talked about it a half an hour ahead of time, and probably will, but I've got a schedule that we've got to keep to. Terry, any last comments or thoughts that you want to drop before we finish off for today?
Just don't be afraid in this area to spend some money. If you want some advice in this area, you could send either a personal message to me or Phil, or you can send a message to the Do the Work page. We'd love to help you out with that. If you're looking to maybe get into the premium Bible market, you have to be invited. Those are closed groups, but we could probably work on that as well because we're both in some of those. So just, any questions to follow up? Because we could talk about this for hours. We didn't get into really too depth of a subject, to believe it or not. So,
No.
um,
One tip that I'll close with, thanks, Terry. There's nothing wrong. Like as a permanent tool, don't use those bonded leathers or true tones. But if you want to give it a test run, it's a good
yeah,
way to dip your toes into the layout and the format. Carefully select, hey, what's the layout like? Is it like the premium Bible that I'm interested in? And carefully select one and give it a 6-month trial. Give it 6 months with that layout, 6 months with that binding, that setting. Do I like it? Do I not like it? All right, well, then I'm not, cycling through thousands of dollars of Bibles, and then I have something that I can maybe give to somebody else because they want to do the same thing. And if you're interested in trying out 5 or 6 different versions of the ESV, I got a stack I can give you. I just did the same thing. I'll charge you excessive shipping rates and minimal costs for the books themselves. Thanks everybody for joining us. I hope that a little lighthearted conversation about the Bible in a different sense is an encouragement to you in your work. Definitely take the time to think about the translation you're going to pick. Definitely think about the way the text is going to be laid out and how you're going to use it, and be intentional after that. This is the one I use for the coffee house. This is the one I use to preach from. This is the one I use for personal studies. These are tools designed to help you be excellent at your job, that God is using you to give increase through. So it's worth every edge of concern and craft. We'll be back again, I think, maybe next week. I'll be in Florida. Terry will be in Alabama trying to hide from Chris Emerson. And so we'll see if the schedule works out for that. But if not that, then definitely I think February the 11th we'll have a show as well. Did you have a comment about Chris Emerson you needed to relay to us here? I think
it's too cold to golf, so I have no idea what he's going to do while he's here.
right. I think he'll nap, and someone will be bringing him, whatever he
Booties, little
desires on a
slippers,
platter, little slippers.
slippers and
We'll
warm
see.
coffee. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Have a great day.